Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we have a very special guest from Israel who has brought us the truth about Israel and the Middle East to our TV screens. Warm welcome to the program, and today's special guest needs no introduction. His name is Chris Mitchell. He is the CBN's bureau chief in Jerusalem. Chris, warm welcome to the Middle East. But I know that I've had the privilege of recording programs in your studios, but welcome to the studios of Revelation TV and that of the Middle East Report.
It's great to be with you, Simon, and thank you for all you do on the Middle East Report, the other shows on Revelation TV, and it's great to partner with you for such a time as this and reporting on so many amazing things happening in our day in the Middle East and around the world.
No, absolutely, Chris. And I also want to thank you for your friendship, your warmth, your kindness to me over the years, and also for allowing me to use your excellent news reports. Without them, I don't think I'd have a Middle East report. So I'm greatly honoured, and I'm sure our viewers are absolutely delighted that you can be on the Middle East Report today, knowing you and watching your news reports from Jerusalem, Dateline. Before we talk about a bit more of your family history and how you got into broadcasting and the challenges of working for Israel to tell the truth of Israel's narrative to a global audience around the world. You've just come back from that shocking earthquake in Morocco. I know that you were the guest of honor for a conference with Christian Friends of Israel this weekend, and you're recording this program with me on my wedding anniversary as well. So it's a very special day. But do you want to share with our viewers what you guys at CBN are doing to help with the awful earthquake situation in Morocco?
I had spent some time in the United States, usually in the summertime. I go back to visit CBN and family as well. We usually have our annual family reunion around July, August. So I just come back to Israel just for maybe 4 or 5 days. I got an email from my boss and asking if I wanted to go to Morocco to cover the 6.8 earthquake that really devastated parts of Morocco. So we left last Monday, and then we were there on the ground Monday night, Tuesday. We went to a few villages with Operation Blessing, and Operation Blessing is CBN's humanitarian arm. So they're there to provide, supplies, help, and hope, actually, to many of these people that were devastated by the earthquake. Earlier this year, we were at the Turkey earthquake. Even more devastating there in Turkey and more widespread. So we had seen this kind of devastation before. And what Operation Blessing did was actually go out to some of these villages, many of them very remote. And for example, the other day, it took a 5-hour trip to this remote village, partly because the roads had been blocked by rock slides and there was heavy equipment and machinery clearing the roads even as we spoke. And during some of these roads, it was very precarious. Rock slides could have happened at any moment. And, we're literally on the side of a mountain. So Operation Blessing really took the effort to go out and go to these villages. They provide food, they provide supplies for many of these families that have lost nearly everything. And one of the other things they do is they supply what these are called, these are solar lanterns. So many of the places where they go, there's no electricity. So these are solar powered, and they provide light for people that really have no electricity. And it not only is symbolic, it provides light, but it also, they believe, provides the light of the gospel that they try to provide when they can. Morocco is a Muslim country, and it's not easy to provide that, but they came in the name of the Lord and provide help to a lot of people.
Amazing. I mean, it's incredible. Operation Blessing, and especially those little lanterns, which are so needed, particularly in times with no electricity. Chris, you've got a really interesting family background. I think a few years ago you did an excellent report looking at your parents' love letters to each other during the Second World War, and I did show that on one of the programs that I did, and it was very, very touching. So your father served with the U.S. Army.
He did. He was in the 5th Army Group, and he went over in 1942. He was actually in the Army when the war began, and I remember a story of him and my mother. They were not yet married. They married after the war, as well as my aunt and uncle were listening around the radio and listening to Pearl Harbor. And they knew all of them at the same time, and some of them were crying at the time that they would be going in or staying in. My dad was, as I said, in the Army, and he stayed in. So he served from 1939 to 1945. He went over in, 1942, flew and, went on a transport ship with the danger of U-boats, during that time, landed in Casablanca in Morocco, ironically, where I just came from, and at the end of the North African campaign. But he was preparing then to go to Sicily. He was on the first day, D-Day, of the invasion of Sicily. He got malaria there, and actually was in the hospital for a few weeks, and then rejoined his unit, which is in Italy. So he was in the Italian campaign all the way up to ended the war in Cortina d'Ampezzo, which is a jet-set resort now, and had been, but he was actually the highest-ranking officer in the town at one time. And what we discovered when my mother passed away in 2002 were these love letters from my father during the war, from 1942, actually, when he left New York Harbor, went to Bermuda for a few days, and then sailed across the Atlantic. And the last letter was in 1945, after they had been married and when they had moved into their first apartment. And in that letter, he had said that he wanted her to receive the first letter from him, and that he was thankful to God that he had been spared during World War II and all the experiences he had, and that they prayed that God would have bless him and their soon-to-be family. My 2 brothers and my sister. I'm the last of 4 children. And so the letters are just a wonderful chronicle of 2 things. The love that was growing between my mother, and he called her AJ. Her name was Ann Jean, and it usually was, the salutation was Dearest AJ. And so the love that had begun before the war and was going all the way through the war. And also a chronicle of his wartime experiences. Talked about what it was like to be under enemy barrage, what it was like. He was in the medical unit, so he actually provided litter bearers and ambulances to go up to the front lines. They were maybe 5 miles behind the front lines, and they would get the dead and wounded and bring them back, and he would oversee some of the medical units in the hospitals during the war. So he saw a lot, and he talked about it during the latter days of his life, and it was a wonderful chronicle, a really family legacy that I wanted to put in book form so that my children and grandchildren can see the kind of legacy that their grandmother and grandfather left for them.
Amazing. Yeah, very, very special generation. Yeah. Chris, you were born and raised in the Boston area of the United States.
Yeah.
Of course, wonderful kind of British heritage and Irish heritage in Boston as well, and was the biggest city built after Jamestown from the early British pioneers who settled there, particularly those who took that epic journey on the Mayflower to discover the new land or the new frontier. Yeah. Just share with us what your upbringing was like in Boston, and when did you first have an encounter with the Lord?
So I grew up in an Irish Roman Catholic family. All my grandparents came from Ireland. 2 of them, my grandmother and grandfather on my father's side, came from County Kerry. My mother's mother came from Mayo, and my mother's father came from County Galway. So all there on the West Coast. And so being Irish was a big part of my upbringing, and being Catholic was a big part of that as well. I was an altar boy, a choir boy, went to Catholic grammar school and high school. But I had a bit of my encounter starts spiritually, starts at 16 years old, and it started at Dunkin' Donuts, and 8 years later it ended at McDonald's. So at 16, my sister and I remember she must have had the car, and we must have been on our way to Mass. But we didn't go to Mass. We went to Dunkin' Donuts. And instead of having communion, we had probably sugar crullers, or one of my favorites, a Boston filled donut. And that began sort of a spiritual journey for me. It was a big deal to actually skip Mass. And I remember being there ordering donuts, and it was sort of a spiritual turning point in my life. And partly of it was because, there's wonderful born-again Catholics, but at that time I was really searching for something meaningful in my life. And I was sort of disconnected from the religion experiences that I had been going through. So for about 8 years I was spiritually searching. I had a born-again uncle who really was a very help to me at that time, a spiritual and emotional anchor at a very vulnerable time in anyone's life, a young man's life from 16 to 24, but also we're talking, this is the late 60s, early 70s, with Vietnam. There was a lot of cultural turmoil going on, so it was a very difficult time. And then my uncle, introduced me to a pastor, and I had a very nice conversation with him. He introduced me to somebody. He said, you should meet him. Well, we decided to meet at McDonald's on May 8, 1977, and I had a filet fish sandwich, a vanilla shake, and French fries. And in addition to that, we spent about 2 hours talking about what it meant to be born again. How do you invite Jesus into your heart? And sort of this was like foreign language to me. But after 2 hours, we left each other, and I remember being on the intercom was the music from Jesus Christ Superstar. And it just kind of meant something to me. And I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I left from McDonald's, and I was living on Capitol Hill with some friends on D Street. And from the time I left McDonald's to D Street, something happened. I had an epiphany. I had an encounter with the Lord. And it was like He came into my heart. I said a sinner's prayer either before or after that time, but I remember the spiritual experience for me was like all of a sudden it became a relationship with Jesus, and not a religion, not a formula that you had to follow. And from that day till today, it's been a relationship with Jesus that, as the song says, He walks with me and He talks with me and He tells me I am His own. And that's what happened from 1977 to here we are, 2023. And it's just, I'm just so thankful that He came into my heart.
Amazing. And show us, you did an undergraduate course in history.
Right.
Show us why you decided to do a history degree, and how did that kind of prepare you for a career in journalism?
Well, the only thing I was really interested in, I think at that time, I had to choose a major like most students have to do when they go to university or college. And the one thing that was interesting to me was history. I love current events. I love to read about history like you do. And, we've talked about some of the historical parts of World War II and other times in history. So I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I didn't feel like I was qualified to try to be a doctor. So I chose history. And there's not a lot you can do with that unless you want to be maybe a teacher. I didn't want to be a teacher. Well, that did prepare me for journalism. I went to school in 1970. I graduated in 1975 from the University of New Hampshire. And I still was unsure of where we wanted to go. And I'm 75. 2 years later, I was born again, and that changed my life completely. About a year later, I met my wife, Elizabeth, in Washington, D.C. And we got married. We lived in Boston for about a year, and then we moved to Michigan for several years, about 6 years. And during that time in Michigan, I did a lot of different jobs. I worked in 2 factories. I drove a school bus. I painted houses. And I was still unsure about what I wanted to do, but I knew, in fact, it was in one of the factories that I was working in, and I was the shipper-receiver. And we would take these pallets with huge spools of metal on this particular factory. And one of the jobs I had to do was to take the wooden pallets, because they didn't want to save them. I would actually burn them in back of the factory. was like my personal bonfire. And one night I really had an epiphany, like, you know, this was providing for my family. It was a good job. It was a good paying job for that area. But I knew there was something more that I felt like God wanted me to do. So I had admired Pat Robertson and CBN for years. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try to get a job at CBN. I applied. They weren't hiring at the time. And then I thought, well, maybe I should try to apply to the university that had just started a few years earlier. That was CBN University at the time. Now it's called Regent University. So we moved there, my wife and I, in 1985, with my son then 2.5. Now he's 40. And so we applied. I went to the School of Communication. And the only place I really wanted to work was CBN. I admired what they did and how there was I thought a wonderful, and still do, a wonderful combination of professionalism and the anointing of the Holy Spirit. And so I was able to graduate in 1988. I started working with CBN in 1989. I was first a researcher for the 700 Club to do features and testimonies. Then about 2 years later, well, about 7 months later, I became a producer for testimonies and features. And then about 2 years later, I became in the news department. That would be 1992. And been in the news department ever since. Amazing.
So your first visit, I think, reporting in Israel was back in 1996.
That's right.
What was that like? And did you have a spiritual and biblical understanding in the importance and significance of Israel before you did that reporting? And then what was it like to be in Israel for the first time, reporting for CBN on some of the incredible developments that we saw that year? I mean, the election between Benjamin Netanyahu and Shimon Peres shortly after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. The Oslo Accords were in full motion back then. And yeah, it's an incredible time to be in Israel.
It really was. Yeah, it was very, very much an incredible time to be there. Spiritually speaking, for me, it was another epiphany, I guess you could say. I felt like the Lord was this proud landowner. Here I am in the promised land. And I really felt this sense that he was showing me his land. And I fell in love with the land and the people. My one regret was that my wife Liz and our 3 children, Philip, Kathleen, and Grace, weren't with me, because you can tell stories, show pictures or videos, but it's not like being there actually in person. So, but that was the beginning, I guess, of a relationship with the land of Israel and its people. We went again in 1997 and 1998. And during those times, in particular, there was one experience. I went to a message, I believe this was 1997, and Derek Prince was speaking. Many people may know he's a well-known British Bible teacher. And he shared a message, but the one thing I remember most was a story he told. In 1948, he was getting discharged from the British Army, and he was telling a elderly Jewish woman that he wanted to live in Jerusalem. And she said, well, Derek, you don't choose Jerusalem. Jerusalem chooses you. Wow. And when he did, it just pierced my heart, and I thought, Lord, are you choosing us for Jerusalem? And well, next year, my boss put out a offer for volunteers to start a news bureau in Jerusalem, and that was just before our third trip, 96, 97, and 98 to Israel, again on assignment with CBN. And after my wife and I prayed about it, fasted about it, we felt like we would say yes, and we were the only ones to volunteer. And that was, and we thought we would come in 1999. Because of budget reasons, they delayed it to 2000. So Liz and our 3 children, we moved there in August of 2000. So now it's been 23 years since we've been there. It was an exceptional, amazing experience for all of us, because right after we arrived in August, the second intifada began in the end of September. And that was, as you know, 3 to 4 year period of shootings, terror attacks, bus bombings that were home to our home, school, and work. And yet, in the midst of that, God protected us. I feel like it was sort of like Psalm 91. He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. And he protected us all during that time.
I mean, it was really a baptism of fire. I mean, you go to to the streets of Jerusalem. No one was walking the streets. No one was doing their usual kind of shopping and enjoying the cafes and the bars that we know so much that Jerusalem is like now, including other cities in Israel. But share with us what it was like covering the kind of second intifada. And of course, one thing maybe our viewers in the UK don't appreciate so much is the incredible relationship between the United States and the modern state of Israel, not only in terms of that pioneering spirit that forged the United States with moving with the new frontiers, moving the manifest destiny, and that also collaboration also with the Israelis, seeing them as being pioneers as well as that political support that comes from Washington to Israel as well, and the cultural role that Israel plays within American society is huge. So how did you cover, for example, that second intifada, which was horrific and a very dangerous time to be in Israel?
It was a very dangerous time, and you didn't know what would happen or when it would happen or where it would happen. I remember one time an Arab friend of mine saying, well, don't drive near the buses. Well, if you know you're in Jerusalem, because a lot of bus bombings had happened, as you're driving in Jerusalem, it's not easy to avoid any of the buses. So it was a very dangerous time and a very precarious time. Covering it was challenging. We had just moved there, so you're moving a family to a new place, a new culture. You got to get your kids in school, where you're going to go grocery shopping, all these daily things that you have to manage, and in the midst of a very volatile, very dangerous time. So it was challenging in that way, but it was also emotionally hard. I mean, it's almost like so many people were experiencing PTSD at that time. And it almost became numbing in a sense. You're going to another bus bombing, one more. I mean, how many people were killed in this one? It wasn't routine, but it became a regular occurrence where things would happen on a weekly or if not daily basis. So it was very difficult and challenging. But we continued to report on what was happening and tried to give a context to what was happening. And as we know more now about what Yasser Arafat was planning, it just wasn't necessarily a spontaneous uprising. There were evidence that this was pre-planned. And the visit on September 28, 2000 by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount presumably was the spark that lit this. But it really was talked about by Yasser Arafat and others before that. And then we saw the carnage that happened on a unusual, a very, very tragic level.
And what is it like? I can only imagine it's incredibly special to actually produce news reports from Israel and Jerusalem in particular, to live and work there. I know it's an incredible place. We know that Israel is the apple of God's eye. You have that prophetic dimension when it comes to the reporting, because we see literally in the land of Israel the fulfillment of biblical prophecy being fulfilled before our eyes, and it's a very, very special time put out there, but also immensely challenging and also very spiritually difficult and dark at times. But share with us how that challenges you, motivates you to tell Israel's narrative, which is a real privilege, I believe.
It really is. It really is a privilege and a challenge and a responsibility as well. And thankfully, in your reporting and ours, we can use the Bible as a resource and a biblical perspective, and that makes such a difference. For example, the term West Bank. I mean, many people believe that could be a political entity. It really isn't. But this is the land of Judea and Samaria. This is the biblical heartland of Israel. So when you see that from a biblical lens, you understand the things that are happening. For example, when we go down to Ben Gurion Airport and cover a return of Jewish immigrants, or Orlim as it mentioned in Hebrew, you're watching prophecy come to life. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the other prophets prophesied more than 2,000 years ago that this would happen, that God would gather his people back to the land of Israel. And so it's really an amazing experience to see that actually happening in real life and unfolding before your eyes. Isaiah said that Israel would become like a light to the nations, and we see the medical, agricultural, technological innovations that are coming from the land of Israel, and that again is a sign of what's happening in the land. And Zechariah said that Jerusalem itself would become a stumbling stone to the nations, and we see that increasingly the nations of the world are pointing their attention to the city of Jerusalem. Someone has said, that city is sort of like the crossroads of history and prophecy. And going back to the fact that I was a history major, you just see history and prophecy unfolding before your eyes.
Incredible. And Chris, for our viewers watching, how do you put together one of your Jerusalem Dateline reports, which you do 2 a week now, don't you? So
yeah, we do.
That's a huge task.
It is a huge task.
So just unpack for us the process of how you put one of your reports together.
Well, it's a bit organic. I mean, it continues to evolve because things change and events happen, and press releases come out, and maybe an archaeological announcement that this new discovery, or maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to go to the United Nations. So things happening all the time. So you're continuing to evolve what you're going to include or not include in the program, or maybe you'll include a particular segment or interview in this program or wait till the next one. So it really happens on a day-to-day basis, sometimes during the day. Could be a terror attack, tragically, that happens, and you have to stop things and cover that. So as somebody said, it's a target-rich environment, and it's almost like trying to drink out of a fire hose sometimes. Things happen so much and so rapidly, you just try to keep up, and you try to decide prayerfully which stories to include and what not to include. You have only so much time and resources to be able to cover all the stories that are going on in Israel and the Middle East, so you want to decide prayerfully how to wisely use your resources and your times to present the stories that you feel like the viewers need to hear and see, just like you do in the Middle East Report. You want to make sure that you're up to date and you're reporting on what people really need to know.
Absolutely, and a reminder to our viewers that you can watch Jerusalem Dateline exclusively on Revelation TV. Chris, if I look back at your 23 years in Israel, and you look at some of the major key developments at that time, one of the big stories that you worked on was the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and that was a very scary time to be in Israel when Hezbollah were firing their rockets and missiles from southern Lebanon, and almost a third of Israel's population literally had to move to the south, to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, where they could be protected from these rockets and missiles. And of course, we saw that the Israeli Defense Forces had to mobilize their forces to go into southern Lebanon as well to take out Hezbollah's rockets and missiles. Share with us what it's like to be in Israel when the whole world is focusing on Israel at that time. And of course, we see that thanks to the work of CBN, you're able to tell the truth of Israel's narrative.
Yeah, well, that was a very intense time, and much of that war we spent up in a place called Metula, which is literally on the Israeli-Lebanese border. You could look across into South Lebanon and also see the deployment of many of the tanks and troops of the IDF that were going into Lebanon. That was, at that time, Hezbollah had an estimated 14,000 rockets, and I think almost 4,000 were fired into northern Israel. And as you say, they were either living in bomb shelters or had fled the area. Now, 17 years later, Hezbollah has maybe an estimated 150 to 200,000 rockets and missiles, some of them precision guided, and which represents, one of the major threats to Israel right now. So covering that during that time was very intense, but it was also a little surreal because we were able to report Monday through Friday up there on the northern border. That's when CBN broadcast Monday through Friday. We would go back to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was quiet at the time, and you wouldn't know that there's actually a war going on. But up there in the north, it was very intense. I remember one time I was on the phone with my wife up in Metula. She was back in the United States at the time, and the siren went off. And she said, "Chris, is that the siren?" And she didn't know how precarious it was up there on the border. But we felt like the Lord protected us during that time. Ironically, Metula was so close to the border, many of the rockets and missiles went over us, and they landed in a place called Kiryat Shimona, just a few miles down the road from Metula. But any time, like the 2006 Second Lebanon War and the wars between Hamas on the southern border, in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2021, they can be very intense and precarious, but ironically, or not ironically, but sometimes in those situations you really feel God's peace in the midst of that danger, and you feel like it's sort of like this Psalm 91 iron dome, spiritual iron dome over us during those times.
So literally, this is when you become a news reporter to a war correspondent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So let's have a look at one of Chris Mitchell's excellent reports on Jerusalem Dateline, and this is a recent report looking at the threat posed by Hezbollah to Israel, and as a reminder of what happened all those years ago, back in 2006.
Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, growing danger on the northern border as Israel and Hezbollah confront each other in a high-stakes showdown. And reservists refusing to serve in protest of judicial reform legislation. And archaeologists unveiled the site where Israel's tabernacle stood for hundreds of years at Shiloh. Plus, a Jewish and Christian ministry collaborating to help a woman flee for her life from Gaza. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Northern Israel is facing an increased aggression from Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terror group. Residents there fear that after 17 years of relative peace, war could break out. Behind me is a spectacular view of southern Lebanon. After the 2006 Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah has been rearming and now has as many as 200,000 rockets on the other side of the border. CBN News joined former IDF Colonel and National Security Advisor Kobi Marom on a tour along the border.
We saw an amazing rearming process from Iran through Damascus to the Hezbollah infrastructure. And we decided to not respond, decided to have a restraint policy. That's the reason why the major threat against the Israeli people today, 2023, 200,000 rockets and missiles across the border right here that can target today Tel Aviv and other Israelis. That's the major threat for Israel.
That arsenal serves as a deterrent to keep Israel from attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. And Marom believes the regime has given Hezbollah a green light to turn up the heat.
The Iranians have a high self-confidence, many diplomatic achievements lately across the Middle East. They understand that they can put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government and the IDF, if they will succeed with the Hezbollah, to create an attrition war along this border right here.
This wall serves as one of Israel's responses.
They're really concerned about the fact that Israel is going to build a wall, an obstacle along the 70 miles of the Lebanese border, because their wall plan is to occupy neighborhoods from the Israeli communities along the border and disrupt totally the Israeli war plans.
Behind me is a closed military zone, and up on the hillside are the tents set up by Hezbollah for the last several weeks inside Israeli territory, the latest provocative act by the Iranian-backed terror group. The question now is, will Israel destroy the tents or allow them to remain? In the meantime, Hezbollah is pushing the envelope. Propaganda videos are rampant, ranging from this simulation of an attack on an IDF outpost to intimidating military exercises. And this footage shows Hezbollah special forces patrolling the border fence in violation of the UN resolution that ended the last war. Marom also sees Hezbollah taking advantage of Israel's internal division.
They look to the tough struggle inside the Israeli society as a great opportunity to create challenges to the Israeli government, to the Israeli people.
Marom also fears what could potentially result from the combination of the terrorist bravado and this precarious situation.
Is it possible that we face a war between Israel and Hezbollah in the near future? Yes, it's possible, with a miscalculation of one of the sides.
So if you've never seen Jerusalem Dateline, it's an absolute must, because we see there Chris Mitchell reporting on the front line, particularly the threat posed by Hezbollah to the north of Israel in southern Lebanon. Chris, what would you say are the challenges of reporting from Israel? Because we know that the mainstream media, whether it's CNN, whether it's the BBC or other mainstream international news corporations, have a bias against Israel. They often tell the Palestinian narrative, or even on occasions the Hamas narrative, which is designed to erode Israel's moral standing in the world. It also leads to an escalation in Jew hatred around the world. So there's huge responsibilities to actually report the truth. But share with us the challenge you face and CBN faces in actually reporting the truth of Israel's situation when we know that she's surrounded by hostile terrorists like Hezbollah, Hamas, that want to see a destruction, the Iranian regime that wants to see Israel wiped off the face of the earth, and the struggle to get Israel's story out to the world, essentially.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that sometimes things get obfuscated. There's confusion and there's a lack of context. One example was when there was a disturbance on the Temple Mount not too long ago, and the world media presented it as if the Israelis were the aggressors going into the Temple Mount in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you look at the entire story, maybe a few hundred Muslims had barricaded themselves into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they were going to stay there and preventing Muslim worshippers from coming in. And so they had prepared fireworks, rocks, knowing that the IDF, after hours of negotiation, actually went in to get these young men out of the mosque. So what you had when they went in was, it appeared that the IDF had sort of stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque by themselves without any context, understanding the situation. So sometimes you need to find out what's the entire story. Many times in much of the world's media, they present a story that lacks the context and the continuity of what's happening. So that's part of the challenge. Some of the other things, recently we did a report on a BBC presenter who said to Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, but part of the opposition now, isn't it true that Israeli soldiers love to kill Palestinian children? And anything but. They do raids sometimes into Jenin or Nablus or other places, other Palestinian cities and towns, because they want to stop terror attacks that are murdering and killing Israelis. Also, Christiane Amanpour, on a CNN report, was interviewing Rabbi Leo D., whose wife and 2 daughters had been killed in a terror attack. But the way she put it is that they had been killed in a shootout, as if his wife and daughters was shooting with Palestinian terrorists. It was literally a terror attack on one of Israel's highways where they were killed. So those are kind of the bias, or the examples of sometimes the bias in some of the world's media. So it's challenging to report accurately and truthfully of what's happening, and try to get a better perspective, more accurate as much as we can, to tell the story of what's really happening. The same thing happened in the Second Intifada. Many of those terror attacks were sort of a moral equivalence between the Israeli response and the Palestinian terror attack that usually come from Yasser Arafat and the PA.
Which is extremely troubling, because what it does is it inflames Muslim public opinion, not only in the Middle East, but also in the West as well. And we see then huge spikes in Jew hatred, attacks against Jewish communities, and synagogues being attacked, and Jewish community centres also being attacked as well. And then this ratchet of hatred steps up against Israel. And that's why you're doing such an important job for Israel through CBN. But share with us, Chris, some of the miracles, because you can't not be in Israel and report from Israel for over 23 years and not see incredible miracles take place, because we are commanded as Christians to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to pray and intercede for that nation, and yet we look back countlessly through Israel's history, and we see God's hand of deliverance, whether that was at the Yom Kippur War or Israel's recent war back in 2014, when one missile was flying towards the Kobe Towers, I think, in Tel Aviv, and just before they got there, this wind pushed them into the sea, and anyone who's been to Tel Aviv knows you don't get much wind in Tel Aviv. So share with us some of the kind of miracles that you've seen.
There are. It's a land of miracles. As Ben Gurion said, to be a realist in Israel, you have to believe in miracles. Let me just add one other point about what we were just talking about. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Authority, they understand how to manipulate the media. So many times they do provocations in order to use that the Israeli response, and they knew how to manipulate the media in many ways. So that's one factor in what's going on. But as you said, Israel is a land of miracles. I think in the last, one thing I look at is the miracles in archaeology right now that are happening. Recently we did a story on Shiloh, or some people call it Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord stood for maybe 400 years, nearly 400 years, where the prophet Samuel was, where Eli, the high priest, tragically died in that place. But they're doing excavations now, actually finding where they believe the tabernacle of the Lord actually was. When you go to the city of David, the Pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the blind man, recorded in John chapter 9, they're now uncovering the whole entire Pool of Siloam since 2000. In the 2000, I think 2004, some of it had been exposed, but now the entire pool will be excavated. In addition to that, the pilgrimage road from the pool all the way up to the Temple Mount is being excavated. These are places where Jesus would have walked.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen that last December, and that was very special.
Yeah, and one of the miracles is Iron Dome, with this Israeli anti-missile system was developed, I think, within about 36 months, where the equivalent of a bullet hitting a bullet that really protects Israelis and Palestinians, for that matter, in many of these wars. You see technological miracles in the sense of Israel being a light to the nations and seeing, these marvels in agriculture and medicine, technology that really are being a blessing to the world, a light to the nations. And you see the miracle of Aliyah coming, as the prophet said all over, that Jewish people would be called back to the promised land, and it's happening. So you're seeing prophecy coming alive, and it's a miraculous thing that 75 years after Israel became a nation, it's really becoming an amazing place, and a place where many people are finding their destiny.
Absolutely. And Chris, how much would you say that the scriptures in Genesis 12, 1-3, when God's promise to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you, feature so much as the underlying story in so many of your news reports, that the way that the nations interact with Israel, they either bless the nation of Israel or they curse the nation of Israel, largely determines so many kind of news events around the world.
It's really true. I mean, it's almost like a spiritual demarcation for many of the nations. And I think many of the nations are in the valley of decision right now. Will they stand with Israel or will they not? And sometimes you can see that demonstrated by whether or not they're going to move their embassy to Jerusalem. I think there's 4 nations now that are moved their embassy. One is planning to move their embassy. So this is sort of a time when many of the nations are deciding where are they going to stand on Israel? Are they going to bless it? Are they going to curse it? Are they going to stand in the middle? And I think, as Joel says, that he will enter into judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat for the nations, and whether or not they have divided his land. And so that's why it's so important when you think about the Oslo Accords and you think about whether or not Israel's going to give land back to the Palestinians, to Lebanese, or on the Gaza Strip, and it does make a difference. So seeing that biblical context And the profound implications of Genesis 12 and whether or not you're going to bless or curse Israel really makes a huge difference for the nations.
And share with us that incredible historic moment. I think it was back in December of 2017 when US President then Donald Trump announced the embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and recognized Israeli sovereignty and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital. And then for Israel's 70th anniversary, the actual US embassy was opened in Jerusalem. Share what it's like when you have moments of history unfold before our eyes like that.
As a student of history like yourself, it's really incredible. It's to be an eyewitness to moments like that in May 14th, 2018, when it happened. It really is. You kind of pinch yourself and you kind of think you want to take a mental picture of what it was like being there at the ceremony when the U.S. Embassy was inaugurated. And as you said, in December, he made the announcement that it's going to be moved. And what a historic date to time to decide May 14th, the same date when it was founded in 1948. It was really remarkable. When you see things happen, anywhere from the Morocco earthquake, Turkish earthquake, being there in the front lines of when ISIS was taking over parts of Iraq and Syria, or historical moments like the moving of the embassy. It's really, to see history unfold is just an amazing privilege and honor to be there at places like that, being a student of history.
Amazing. So let's have a look at this Jerusalem dateline going back to May 2018 when President Trump moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem in a historic ceremony.
This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the move of the Embassy of the United States to Jerusalem. Plus, Israel hits back at Iran's military buildup inside Syria. Is it the prelude to a wider Mideast war? And Scott Ross takes to the streets to take the pulse of Israelis and hear what they're saying about the move of the U.S. Embassy. Up next, a look at why many feel the move of the U.S. Embassy will be a blessing for America. President Trump's daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner are among those attending the U.S. Embassy move celebration. President Trump is being hailed as courageous for implementing a 23-year-old law mandating the move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And as we'll see, the move represents a significant turning point for the city and the Jewish people. All of this excitement comes 70 years to the day after President Harry Truman became the first world leader to recognize the State of Israel.
I think America is coming in alignment with biblical truth.
The Bible mentions Jerusalem and Zion almost 1,000 times. It's also been the capital of the Jewish people for 3,000 years.
This has been a theme that's in our spiritual DNA. And therefore, when the President of the United States moves the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital, he is addressing something at the core of Jewish identity.
Behind me is the home of the new U.S. Embassy. President Trump is making history as he moves the embassy from Tel Aviv here to Jerusalem. That history started thousands of years ago when King David captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. 400 years later, the Jewish people are expelled for 70 years to Babylon, then returned to rebuild the Second Temple with the help of Persia's King Cyrus. Former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Dory Gold says Trump's embassy move might even compare to that biblical king.
That was a huge charitable act on his part, which is in our historical memory. And the fact that now President Trump is going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem puts him in a special category, and perhaps even the category of the ancient King Cyrus of Persia.
Fast forward to 1967 and the Six-Day War, when Israel reunites Jerusalem under its sovereignty. Then in 1980, Israel officially makes Jerusalem its capital, and countries worldwide move their embassies from the city in protest.
The Christian embassy was founded after 13 national embassies left Jerusalem, and it provided a unique moment where the Jewish people were willing to accept our hand of friendship.
David Parsons is with the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. As a lawyer, he helped draft the Jerusalem Embassy Act, passed by Congress in 1995, mandating the embassy move to Jerusalem.
And now, 22 years later, after all these delays and waivers, it is back to our order. Trump has recognized Jerusalem. The ambassador is going to be working here, and then they're going to start building the building. So it's sort of a moment of personal vindication for me.
Tony Perkins and Michelle Bachmann are on President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Council. They said the move will be good for the U.S., other nations, and Mideast peace.
The scripture is pretty clear on that, and that those who bless Israel will be blessed.
Israel's enemies have always fought on the propaganda argument of words, the fact that Israel was illegitimate and had no right to this land. President Trump, excuse the pun, played a Trump card. He's taken that argument off the table. He said, look, we aren't going to even talk about this anymore, that Jerusalem is or isn't Israel's. It is. We're making a decision. It is.
President Trump's decision effectively recognizes the western part of the city as Israel's capital. Most holy sites are in the eastern part. Gold says only in a united Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty would those sites be protected.
Jerusalem's been the capital of the Jewish people for 3,000 years. I don't see that changing. I think as long as we have freedom of worship, freedom of access guaranteed, I think that many in the Arab world will acquiesce to the idea that Jerusalem remains the undivided capital of Israel.
And to be part of history is something very special. So that was a very special moment in Israeli-American relations as President Donald Trump moved the US Embassy from its place in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Israel's eternal capital, the city of Jerusalem. Chris, it must be incredible to report on actual news events as they break, particularly the moving of the US Embassy to Jerusalem, that really did forge an incredible relationship between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and, of course, US President Donald Trump. But what is it like to actually interview these leaders, including the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Friedman, who was America's ambassador, the ambassador to Israel, Secretaries of State, and the likes? What was it like to interview the people that actually set the policies that set the agenda for nations?
Well, it's a privilege, and it's also sometimes challenging. And I'll give you an example. Well, first of all, we've interviewed Ambassador Friedman several times, and really remarkable man that really was there at a unique time, as they say, for such a time as this, and observant Orthodox Jew who believes in the Bible, who really saw himself as chosen by God for that time. In fact, in his office, he had a painting of the 10 and the 12 spies that were sent into the land, the Promised Land, to spy out the land. And we know the story that 10 of the spies came back with a bad report. His motivation with that painting was that he wanted to do like Joshua and Caleb. He wanted to take the land in whatever manner that meant as ambassador. Sometimes it's challenging because I remember we interviewed then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Cairo, and we were given 4 minutes because of his schedule. I mean, sometimes his schedule is prescribed minute by minute. They gave us 4 minutes, and in the middle of maybe 2 minutes into the interview, off camera, his assistant was saying, "Okay, wrap it up." And I'm thinking, we just started, I just got to my second question. Well, I went ahead with 2 more questions, and maybe the assistant didn't like that, but we tried to use what we could. So it's very challenging, and you want to maximize the time. Ask the right questions. Ask the questions that would be perhaps most insightful or most important for viewers to understand about what these policymakers are deciding.
Excellent. We've got 3 minutes left of the programme. I could certainly do another programme with you, Chris, because I'm really enjoying it, and I'm sure our viewers are as well. So 2 very important questions. It's been a very dramatic year for Israel this year, as Israel's marked its 75th anniversary. We've seen unprecedented demonstrations against Israel's proposed reform of Israel's judiciary, which has divided the nation. But we've also seen a challenge in Christian-Israeli relations. And as a news channel, you have not backed off from those difficult challenges, particularly when it comes to Christian-Israeli relations with the current government and the difficulties. Share with us how difficult that is to actually report on those news stories.
Well, judicial reform has been very challenging because it's probably one of the most divisive times in Israel's history, certainly in the last 23 years that I've reported on. The comparison would be in 2005 when Ariel Sharon, then the prime minister, withdrew from the Gaza Strip, was really divisive. This even more so, according to many Israelis that I've talked about. A couple of points to make. Some of the critics of the judicial reform, like say Gideon Sa'ar and others in the opposition that are criticizing, actually were proposing the same kind of judicial reform that the Supreme Court would bring, where they would pull back some of the powers that the Supreme Court has really usurped in the past 15 or 20 years. That's one thing. And also there's elements that are trying to divide Israel that are behind some of these protests that have been going on for months. The other issue about the Christian-Israeli relations or Jewish relations is that there have been a couple of things. 2 ultra-Orthodox members of the Knesset proposed a law making it a criminal offense for anyone to persuade anyone to change their religion. And it seemed to be targeted specifically towards Christians or maybe Messianic believers in Israel. Thankfully, that legislation never made it to committee, never got to vote. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, after a flurry of news reports about this, tweeted out that his government would not pass any legislation to harm the Christian community. And it speaks to his balancing act now between many of the ultra-Orthodox parties or religious parties that are part of his coalition. So he has to balance this balance between evangelical Christians and his government.
Well, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today, and thank you so much for the amazing work you and your team do at Jerusalem Dateline and bringing us the truth about Israel and the Middle East. And we'd all be in the dark without it. So the work you're doing is so important and so vital. So pray for God's protection and pray for God's influence as well for your team in Jerusalem. So thank you so much.
So great to be with you, Simon.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching at home. This has been an absolute privilege to interview Chris Mitchell today. Please pray for him. Please pray for his team working in Jerusalem, that they would have God's favour and God's protection as they bring the truth from Jerusalem to the world. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.